So I found something really interesting about the money we make in Canada as compared to the US. And believe it or not, it all started with the job posting I saw on LinkedIn. You see, as I was browsing open job positions, I came across this very job posting. And as I was reading through the job description, I found this very specific wording. It was about the salary that was being offered. The job was paying about 138,000 Canadian dollars for anyone in Canada, but it was paying up to 151,000 US dollars for anyone in the US. Adjusted for currency, that's a 55% increase for candidates in the US as compared to the ones in Canada. 55%. At first, I thought it made sense because things are expensive in the US, but as I dug deeper into the numbers, I realized how it does not. I also found out that this phenomena is called wage suppression and how it's really making living in Canada harder for everyone. So that's what we'll talk about today. But let's first quickly talk about what wage suppression really means. Simply put, wage suppression is when companies intentionally pay less than they really should. For instance, imagine a company that's hiring for a role A, and a fair salary for that role is about $100. But the company knows that there are people out there who, out of desperation, would take up the job for, let's say, $75. Now, instead of paying a fair wage of about $100, the company decides to pay $75 to that person. And when this happens at a scale, we have wage suppression. And here in Canada, wages have been suppressed for quite some time now. For example, the average Canadian worker makes about $72,000, whereas an average worker in the US makes about $66,000 US dollars. Adjusted for currency, a worker in the US makes about 32% more than the worker in Canada. But you see, these are just the averages and they don't paint a full picture. So let's take a deeper look. If you take a look at a marketing manager in Canada, they make about 80,000 Canadian dollars on an average. But in the US, for the same role, a marketing manager makes about 114,000 US dollars. And adjusted for currency, it's a 40% difference. And it's just not marketing. Software engineers, financial analysts, project managers in Canada make way less than their American counterparts. And when you look at a city-by-city comparison, the difference even gets bigger. For instance, a senior software engineer in Toronto makes about 120,000 Canadian dollars on an average. Just a few kilometers down south, the same senior software engineer in New York makes about 156,000 US dollars. That's a huge difference. And in many cases, it's the same company that's offering these two vastly different salaries for the same amount of work. But you see, the misery for Canadians just doesn't end here. Not only do the Canadians make less than their American counterparts, they also pay more for everything because the cost of living is much higher in Toronto and Vancouver as compared to the most cities in the US. So Canadians are in this double-bind situation where this whole wage suppression thing is making the situation worse. But you see, things are not always like this. Look at this article by Investopedia, for example. You see, according to it, Canada had one of the wealthiest middle class of any country in the world. And for years, Canada's middle class income was tracking that of US. And finally, in 2021, Canada's middle class income outranked that of the US. But fast forward to 2025, we know that living in Canada is technically worse than in the US. And while I think the issue is quite complex and has many reasons to why Canadians aren't making as much as Americans, but I still think it can be categorized into three main reasons. Starting with Canada's temporary resident program. You see, the program was originally designed to bring in skilled workers that would fill in gaps in the labor market and thus improve the economy. But over the years, it has exploded in scale. Today, Canada has more than 2.5 million temporary residents, and that's about 6% of the entire population. And you see, while bringing in temporary workers isn't the core of the problem. The real problem is that these temporary workers don't have the same rights as permanent residents and citizens. In most cases, these workers are tied to employer-specific work permits, which means they can't just quit even if they're underpaid. And for the ones that have open work permits, like international student graduates, they're just desperate to collect points for PR. And employers know this, and they take full advantage of it. They offer lower salaries because they know these workers will accept less in exchange for a shot at a permanent residency. And this creates a huge power imbalance. Employers don't have to negotiate or offer higher salaries because if one worker quits, there are 1,000 more willing to take the job for much less. And that drags salaries down for everyone. Because when companies can hire people for cheap, they really have no reason to increase salaries for even permanent residents and citizens. And if you compare the situation with the US, things work quite differently there. Firstly, their numbers are much smaller in scale. The number of temporary workers in the US is much lower in proportion as compared to the total population. And for that reason, companies in the US can't rely on an endless supply of underpaid workers and thus have to offer higher salaries to stay competitive. Which brings us to our second reason: the oligarchy of companies. You see, an oligarchy is when a large firm dominates an industry. And in Canada, there's an oligarchy in pretty much every industry. Take the telecom sector for example. Just 3 companies, Bell, Rogers, and TELUS, control over 90% of the market. They keep launching brands with new names, but ultimately everything is simply controlled by a few corporations. And by the way, that's also one of the reasons that we pay so much for our phone bill in Canada as compared to the rest of the world. And if you take a look at the banking sector, 5 major banks control about 80% of the assets in the Canadian economy. And this oligarchy is even true for insurance and retail sector, by the way. Most retailers you come across are controlled by these 3 groups. And this is even true for other industries like energy, insurance, and others. You see, ultimately the point I'm trying to make is, in a situation where a few companies dominate the market, they end up holding significant power over both wages and prices. And with little competition, they have no incentive to increase wages for workers because they know that the workers have fewer alternatives, making it easier to suppress wages without the risk of losing employees to any competitors because there aren't any. And creates a pretty stagnant job market where workers are stuck in low-paying jobs and there's little opportunity available to switch. And when you compare this with the US, you'll see how things are so different because they have a high number of companies in pretty much every industry, which creates a healthy competition where employers are forced to compete for talent and it ends up driving salaries higher. And the third reason I found out for the suppressed wages is that Canada simply has a lower productivity. This one's a bit technical, but stick with me because it explains a lot. Productivity, in simple terms, is how much value a worker produces per hour. The higher the productivity, the more valuable the worker, and typically the higher the wages. And it's for that same productivity reason that we see a software engineer make way more money than, let's say, a barista. Because the value of work is generally higher in software development versus running a cafe. And in Canada, productivity has been on the decline for quite some time now. Even the Bank of Canada has been ringing alarms about this for years. You see, if we look back, in 1984, Canada's productivity was about 88% that of the US. But fast forward 40 years, the productivity has dropped about 71% to that of the US. And as this productivity falls, companies generate less value from each worker. And when businesses make less money per hour worked, they're less willing to pay higher wages. And this creates a vicious circle where lower productivity leads to lower profits lead to lower wages, and these lower wages will lead to a less incentive to invest and work harder for employees, resulting in even lower productivity. And meanwhile, if you compare, productivity in the US has been strong and quite stable. And one of the bigger reasons for that is American businesses invest more in capital, technology, and innovation consistently, whereas Canadian businesses do not. Instead of improving efficiency with better tools, automation, and training, many industries in Canada rely on cheap labor to keep the costs low. And when they face rising costs, they cut wages or hire cheap labor instead of investing and making the productivity higher. And this has really been pushing down Canadian salaries over the years. So what does that all mean? Well, as I researched more and more, I realized that this wage suppression isn't just a temporary thing that Canada is facing. It's kind of built into Canada's economy. The temporary resident program, the oligarchy of companies, the mentality of companies for not investing in people and increasing productivity, those all have and will continue to play a huge role. And if Canada really wants to get out of it, they really need to think about policies and regulations that help and empower the people, as compared to just treating them as cheap, disposable labor. And at the same time, ensure that companies and big corporations are playing fair and are really investing into the Canadian economy and working for the people, not against them. I hope this was useful. I'm Umpreet, and I'll catch you in the next one.